Okay. This is the kickoff meeting for the Container Identity Working Group. For those who aren't familiar with working groups in Kubernetes, they are a less formal kind of SIG. It's intended to bring together participants across multiple SIGs, in general participants in the Kubernetes community, to cover topics that span areas that are outside of a single SIG's responsibility or have kind of cross-cutting implications. The goal of the working group usually is to help identify goals and breakdowns of work, to find design consensus, to identify places where technologies might be relevant inside or outside of Kubernetes for the use of a particular goal. This working group, it doesn't actually exists in a sense as a community-driven coming together of all the folks who have a stake in the particular topic. So this particular topic is container identity. The agenda, I hope everyone has had a chance to read the proposal. We're going to spend some time talking about that. Greg has added an agenda, and we'll go a little bit over that in here. And then at any point, please feel free to jump in. This isn't supposed to be this is not going to be a driven to the schedule sort of meeting. Our goal is to help kind of flesh out in this meeting what we want to talk about in follow-up meetings and identify places where there's either broad alignment, broad disagreement, or some concrete action items that we can take. Greg and I are helping to drive this. This is, again, a community effort like most of the things in Kubernetes. There is a SIG, or there's a working group. There's a working group Google group. I don't have that actually recorded here. I'll go do that. It is Kubernetes-WG-container identity at googlegroups.com. This is kind of the effective channel that we can use to have email conversations. sig-auth is also an appropriate forum, but it's probably best to keep most of these focused on that mailing list at a minimum, and then ensure that others can have access to it. Before we get started, then I was going to go on the agenda. I was going to discuss the working group goals and mission. Are there any questions or comments folks would like to make before we kind of go into a quick high-level overview of that? Okay. So for the last couple of years, there have been on and off discussions about how pods, specifically the processes running in those pods, might integrate with external systems outside of Kubernetes or within Kubernetes to talk to other pods. There's a lot of interesting and exciting work going on in the broader ecosystem, projects and initiatives like Spiffy, work like the Istio project that also have some overlap in this area now. We've been doing a lot of work in SIG node and SIG networking and SIG cluster lifecycle and sig-auth to enable nodes to join a cluster for the nodes to get an identity that is used to authorize the node to host and run workloads, as well as to ensure that we can properly secure nodes and carry that responsibility down. So out of that, we wanted to make sure that going forward, that there's kind of broad consensus across the Kubernetes project about what we can do to make both it easier and more secure for a pod to connect to external services, as well as to enable integrations for existing identity systems. I mentioned this in the comments to the doc, but obviously this is not a new problem. Kerberos for a very long time has been kind of the de facto standard for this in the enterprise setting, and there's a number of tools emerging in both an open source and a very large number of closed source or existing prepackaged commercial off-the-shelf software that also does this. So we want to stay open to the possibility that no matter what good ideas this group brings, that we take into account prior art and make it possible to integrate that wherever, rip and replace or plug and play wherever possible in Kubernetes. Because again, Kubernetes isn't trying to be the be-all, end-all of these solutions or to own the complete solution. It's trying to bring together enough of the glue that you can build effective and secure computing platforms. The mission statement, like I just tried to really high level this, but a couple of people, or this is becoming increasingly common, is containers that need to prove who they are to other containers or to other systems, integrating with existing identity systems. All of the extension work in Kube, this is a really important topic, that Kube is extensible. Kube is a layered system that can have tools built on top of it. In an ideal world, the mechanisms that make it possible to get container identity and to keep that somewhat extensible would be fundamental Kube concepts that make it easy to integrate. And then as well, we would like to, in an out-of-the-box kind of sense for Kubernetes, to make it be as secure and as consistent as possible, so that 2 or 3 different ways of deploying Kubernetes can still reuse the same central security concepts for applications, just to avoid the need to have to continually force everyone to reinvent their own wheel. There's a number of other open topics. Obviously, I think, and I have this at the bottom, but it's probably the most important one, is identifying the non-goals and the boundaries. That's usually what works really well, is trying to find out what we don't want to do, and the structure of things that would prevent us from being able to make progress because we couldn't all agree, or where there's better solutions outside of Kubernetes that should be the focus for our integration. Service identity is a little bit orthogonal to this, but we might as well all discuss it as we go through this SIG, which is Istio and some of the other systems that want to build excellent end-to-end microservice architectures obviously need a way to verify that 2 services talking to each other are entitled to do so. I don't necessarily think that we, in any way in Kubernetes at the core, would believe that it's the right thing to do for Kubernetes to build a complex solution for that. But we absolutely want to enable someone to leverage the other concepts that exist to make, leverage the other concepts in Kubernetes to be able to build a more secure system on top of it. And since service identity is somewhat coupled to DNS and networking and proxying, there are some touch points with Kubernetes that we should be aware of. And finally, the node bootstrapping process, which will continue to be refined over time, as well as continuing to have all the outs that it does today, where you can provide your own bootstrapping and then tell Kube what to do. We'd like to make sure that that cleanly fits into whatever the long-term goals for the for container identity would be. So with that, that's kind of a real quick overview. Greg, did you want to kind of go over some of the use cases and dig into the details of that? Any questions or comments folks want to bring up now?
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss. If you want to just give it a bit of a break and see if anyone has any questions or comments on that stuff first.
Yeah, I mean, if at this point you kind of don't know what the point of the working group would be, or if you have concerns about what the working group would be, I think this is a good opportunity to speak up.
So this is Mark from Google. I do have a slight comment/question. So just as a way of introduction, I lead PM for services and API at Google, and among other things, Istio. The hope that I had for this working group is that we can devise an architecture that can solve 3 things. One is bootstrap identity. The other one was secret and key management. And I see secrets and keys as related, but somewhat orthogonal. And I was hoping that we can get to an architecture that can work in Kubernetes and in Istio, independent of Kubernetes, but the same architecture would work for both. Because I think that would be very valuable for the ecosystem to be able to reuse investment. I was wondering what the community's thoughts on that.
Hi, my name is Karun. I'm from Huawei. So the question I have is the containers that we're talking about in general, is it for the Docker containers or any container that Kubernetes support? And in general, what is a high-level problem statement that we are trying to solve in the security space for the container? That's something is still not clear to me.
Yeah, I think maybe we should move into use cases, because that's basically talking about the problem that we need to solve, and I think it would be kind of a good use of our time to run through some of those and use those as a way to introduce the problem. I'd like to kind of in the fairly short term kind of settle on a group of representative use cases that cover most of what people think they need from Kubernetes identity. And so I might actually just share the screen and, or Clayton, do you want to just click on that, on the container identity doc?
And,
Scroll down.
and I'll bring up the point as well that there are other efforts in SIG-auth to touch on things like secrets. I do think that the hope here was that the mechanisms whereby secrets could be completely externalized from the platform had been brought up. But like as we go through, if it's not clear about whether that's something the working group should or shouldn't cover, let's be sure to bring it up, we'll record it, and then we'll kind of go through and say, is this something that is part of this working group or is informed by this working group? So take it away, Greg.
Yeah, do you want to just, I'll just briefly introduce this document. So I wrote this as kind of like a discussion piece to bring up some of the issues that we've been talking about inside of Google. So there's, if you're kind of new to this identity space, there's a bunch of background and introduction there of various industry efforts, some of which Clayton mentioned already. So Clayton's come up with kind of some general goals for the working group. I tried to come up with some very specific goals for what Kubernetes identity could do and what it could be. So those are in this document here, but I think today we'll focus on kind of use cases because that's sort of problem description. But please go look at this and happy to take comments and suggestions. So scroll down a little bit further. Yeah, past the background. So yeah, this is where I talk about some of the industry efforts. And a little bit further down the use cases. Yeah, so I thought I'd just run through a few of these. There's more in this doc. I'm not going to read through them all. It'd be kind of boring. So I thought I'd run through a few of these and then open it up to other people to talk about use cases that they have that are completely different or not covered here. So secrets Mark mentioned. So I think like at the very least there's I want an identity to access my secret store kind of use case that we'd like to support here. So, and in this case, I've talked about Vault, but it could be any secret store that you're using. It might be a proprietary one. So, essentially, what you're doing is you're storing, I don't know, API keys, TLS certs, keys, that kind of stuff, in some sort of protected storage that is very well audited and logged and whatever. And you want to have each container be able to access just its secrets and nothing else. So one way to do that is to provision an identity to that container that will let you essentially write ACL, write access rules inside of Vault or whatever the system is, and be able to tightly constrain exactly what secrets that container can see. So that's kind of like where I see the crossover of secrets and identities is solving problems like that. In the enterprise space, I think there's a use case where I've essentially centralized all my identity and access management into one system, and it might be Kerberos, it might be Active Directory, or it might be some sort of proprietary system. And that's where I do all my access control. That's why I provision all the identities for the rest of the stuff in my organization. And really, and most of my containers already understand this concept of identity, and I really just want to be able to get that identity to those containers. And the same sort of deal, I would do access authorization inside of those systems. And I wrote here, I need to guarantee that revoking identity in the central system triggers revocation, or more likely, like if I change access control in the central system, I want that to be reflected inside of the identities that are in use inside of Kubernetes. I think that applies to probably all of these use cases. There's also a multi-cloud one so I might be running on-prem, I might be running in a in a cloud itself, but I want to use services from, I want to like kind of mix and match services from various different clouds. I want a BigQuery from Google and an S3 from Amazon or whatever it might be. And I want to be able to have, you know, those mix and match tokens. So I want to be able to have a Google OAuth identity and an Amazon identity for different containers. And same sort of thing for authorization. So I kind of wrote, further up the doc, I wrote as a non-goal authorization. And you can see that in these use cases. I've basically said the authorization will be handled in kind of each of those IAM systems for the cloud, and similarly for the other use cases. I'm just going to skip sharing an identity. So service to service is, I have two things that run inside my cluster, and I want them to talk to each other over mutual TLS. This is what Istio does, and I think it would be nice if we could give Istio a cert that it can use to do that.
And I'll actually point out here that a lot of existing Java and many existing large systems that already exist have some built up code around things like mutual client auth, et cetera. So like Elasticsearch is a great example of the de facto solutions for Elasticsearch security involve minting these very specific client certs and having all of the workers and the shards having one set of client certs that talk to others. To make it possible to do security on top of Kubernetes, we want to try and figure out ways of making it easier to run those sorts of workloads, even if this isn't the primary use case. That idea of adapting, making it easy to run clustered software on top of Kubernetes is obviously one of the things that we think is really important. Running clustered software securely is kind of the asterisk that we don't make a big deal about, but it's the thing that a lot of people actually care about, right? It's not enough to run clustered software if anybody can go access it from anywhere on the internet. And so this, as we go forward, there'll be some things we want to take and talk about how we can adapt existing software to run on top of these kinds of tools.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a lot of momentum behind certificates in general as a way to authenticate things. So I'll just do one more. So if you scroll down just a little bit, this next heading is kind of where I have stuff that sort of runs together in a pod, but actually needs different identities because it has different privilege levels or some other reason that it needs different identities. And this is trying to tease out the kind of at what resolution do we need to apply these identities. And so I was going to talk about ImageMagick, but I think I'll actually talk about the monolithic app one. So I think it's a fairly common pattern to have this large application that you're trying to break out and containerize and move to this new world infrastructure. And that's a very kind of iterative process that can take quite a long time. So I might have this kind of fairly complex business logic piece that's a bunch of different containers grouped into a pod that, for whatever reason, I need to schedule together. They still have some interdependencies that they're expecting. And I don't really want to kind of formally set an API to break these into microservices yet. I'm not really confident enough about kind of the exact interaction that these things will have. And so I think there's definitely a case where I'll have a pod of stuff that is very different pieces that need very different identities, but all get scheduled together in a pod. So this is basically a kind of argument for some sort of identity that can be applied at a container level rather than just at a pod level. So those are the ones I was going to go through that are in the doc. As I said, feel free to add suggestions for ones not covered, but let's throw it open for other people to talk about kind of their identity problems and potential use cases.
Yeah, so and I would say we would want to keep adding things to this use case as they come up. So don't, again, this is in the spirit of this is how we tend to do these comments, and we'll try to, don't feel bad about if you have things that you don't bring up today, adding it into this doc as we go. And we can keep discussing it over the lifetime of the working group for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Matt, you had the question about the Tiller service account and the user service account. And that's an interesting one because Kubernetes has an authorization system, but Tiller is a service running in Kubernetes that itself has an identity on the cluster. That is actually a useful opportunity for those who aren't familiar. The service account concept in Kubernetes was really the first step at this. It's existed since Kubernetes 1.0. And it's at least the idea that there is an identity that is easy to create on the cluster that carries down into the pod and is the placeholder for a more powerful identity potentially in the future. The service account token, in effect, is all we have today to represent the identity of something running in Cube, but it's not specific to an individual pod, right? It's a shared secret that gets passed around. Some of the use cases for integrations in Cube actually would like to do a better job of subdividing those. For instance, obviously passing a shared secret around is a non-optimal long-term solution for proving who you are. And so all of the mechanisms here, I think this is somewhat covered in the use cases as we have it, but integrations into Kubernetes are one of the things we think about a lot. They have a need to have an identity that allows them both to act as themselves and also to act as other participants in Kubernetes. And we'll have some overlap here.
Yeah, are we also talking about some kind of monitoring mechanism where you want to track down suspicious activities and unauthorized, some kind of session hijacking or whatever? Those kind of security stuff as a part of this group.
So I think the goal for Kubernetes in terms of that kind of thing should be that the identities that we assert in the logs are verifiable, and we're really sure that when we write something into logs that it was definitely Greg who made this action on the API server, and we write that into the logs and we're confident about it because our identity system is strong enough that we know that that was a strongly authenticated thing that happened. But I don't think kind of building detections. So I think like the Kubernetes bit is to kind of write those into logs, and I don't think the Kubernetes bit is to build detections on top of that. But I think other people can definitely do that. I think the identity piece here is kind of making sure that the stuff that we write into logs to enable those detections is verifiable and accurate.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Just take some notes while we're going. Other use cases that folks have that they'd like to bring up, things where you're not quite sure whether they fit in the things that Greg listed? I mean, I would expect we'll grow these for sure, but.
Yeah, hi, this is Thomas. Is the scope of an identity limited to a service, or could this go into a more fine-grained example where we actually consider API calls to have different IDs or different security relevant?
You mean different containers have different identities, or even
the same container making API calls on behalf of multiple IDs?
I think that's reasonable. Let me say that the use case that I've heard for this is that within pods, I think Matt Butcher's comment about Helm that's actually an interesting use case, which is when Helm is a component running on top of Kubernetes that wants to act on behalf of a user. That's an example of a container that may have an identity that is also acting on behalf of. How that's implemented may not be clear. Like Helm has an identity and the user has the identity. In the Helm case, it's probably borrowing the identity. I could imagine, though, that there are pods that would potentially want, and I think that Greg has that covered somewhat in his monolithic app. There may actually be a use case for subdividing the identity that the pod has further around those sorts of questions.
Yeah, and a lot of these are just kind of taking the single bootstrap credential that we have today, which is the service account token, which is only recognized by the Kubernetes API server, and doing similar, enabling similar bootstrapping types of use cases from lots of different sources. So what your container does with the credential it receives depends a lot on who issued that credential and what can be done with that. But a lot of these delegation or impersonation or delegated access or scoped access things require an initial bootstrap credential. And so calling out all the use cases for those is good to make sure that we're enabling, all the different types of providers that are going to be giving us these Bootstrap credentials. But I think the fundamental goal is to get that starting credential into the container, and then it can use it for things like impersonation or delegation or scoped access, depending on what the provider that issued that credential allows, right?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think this also plays into kind of like the secrets sort of use case too. So you can imagine like if that Bootstrap thing, or if a Bootstrap thing lets you get access to the secrets vault, that's the way that you've delegated access to some different credential or more powerful credential or whatever it might be. That's a way to do that as well.
Right.
Or maybe like that Bootstrap credential is like I don't know, a Kerberos credential that lets you then get other different identities out of that system.
Right, or even you can imagine a solution where the credential that's injected is the shared secret that could be used with like a macaroon type system, where it actually is further scoping that with additional claims and restrictions every time it uses it. But that is the kernel of a solution that it can use to then wrap and scope before it actually passes that credential out to use against anything external.
I was also going to say, like, I think that in the discussion, I think maybe to contrast this with some of the things that we think we should do, an example of something that probably is a non-goal is a little bit along the lines of Greg's authorization point, but we would say it's not the goal of this to create a system that makes it trivially easy to authenticate other things on Kubernetes, because in some respects that's something that Istio is trying to do and other projects above Kube are trying to do. But I would say that like the goal in all of this is to make it easier to run applications securely on top of Kubernetes. And so every time we have a use case that comes into applications can't do this unless, and it has to do with identity, it should show up in the use cases list. Like we may not actually solve the problem, but that can definitely be material that feeds into other working groups or other SIGs, like SIG apps or the Istio SIGs or Spiffy SIGs, to go and discuss those things.
Clayton, did you just say that it is not a goal to allow authentication?
Oh, sorry. So I was thinking about this in the context of like the problem that I've spent a lot of time chewing on recently is like an example of like Prometheus, right? So Prometheus is an infrastructure component that wants to go out and gather, you may want to gather from a lot of other services. Mm-hmm. Specifically, the job of container identity is not to put in place an authentication system that makes it trivially easy for someone to put authentication in front of their Prometheus metrics gathering data points, right? That's not what this is about. But I would say like if Istio or other projects on top can use the identity to have an authentication and authorization system, that starts to get much closer. Like I think we should be cautious about how far we go down the authentication path here, but we should absolutely design with the goals of the higher level projects in mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like there are some interesting use cases where you want a container, like we've been talking about giving containers identity, but also giving containers the ability to authenticate identity presented by other containers. Maybe not like doing like all the work, but like getting those trust roots. If we're using certificates as the example, like how do you actually know what are the roots that you should believe when people present you credentials?
Yeah, I was actually kind of hoping like to that point is done right. This effort makes it trivially easy for someone to build an example, like I call it the Kelsey example, where Kelsey writes like 50 lines of code and you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that was possible. Like making it easier and easier and easier for people to build those sort of things on top of Kube. And not to have to even really, there's just enough of a bedrock thing that someone can build useful higher level systems. There's definitely a very close line there. I don't think it's out of scope. I just don't want to, I would hate for us to get so fixated on solving that problem that we don't take into account some of the other use cases, might be the way I would phrase it.
So I have a few quick comments, this is Mark. So the first one is about the bootstrap identity versus the long-lived secret. like in my mind, and I would love to hear feedback on that, we should really separate the bootstrap identity from access to a secret vault. Because ideally, I would think from a security standpoint, we would want the bootstrap identity that is used to unlock access to the rest of the secrets, such as keys or possibly application password, to be short-lived and ephemeral, while the whatever is presented in the secret store is maybe externalized and strongly protected and long-lived. Is that something that people would tend to agree with?
So I'll say certainly it's come up a lot that we want to move to a model where there are many, many more ephemeral secrets on the platform that reduce the time for exposure. I think this has been kind of a long-running discussion ever since we started talking about bootstrapping and certificates in general. Is a secret that exists for longer than a couple of hours is unlikely to stay a secret for very long. It had been a hope that the pod lifetime, because I think this has been discussed several times. We talked about cert rotation and key rotation in Cube. It's not within the scope of this working group, but the hope had always been that properly done, you could define certificate rotation in a way that's pretty much automatic. Certificate and secret rotation on the platform in a way that's automatic. If identity is coupled to a pod's lifetime, then a point might be that for many use cases, the pod lifetime is what should actually be limited, because the longer a pod runs, the more likely it is to be, or the more likely it is that it keeps it, and turning over the infrastructure actually has other benefits. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's certainly something that's come up a lot in sig-apps and sig-auth before.
I think we want to make sure that applications that are well behaved, either by responding to dynamic config changes or being stateless and tolerating being rotated in a rolling manner, applications that are well behaved are easy to put this ephemeral management on top of. But we still have to make sure that we can work with applications that are not well behaved. People are bringing existing applications to Kubernetes, and so like documenting best practices and trying to build the tools and the infrastructure to let someone who has a well-behaved application say, yep, rotate me when my cert expires, or send me a signal when my cert got renewed and I need to pick it up. Making sure that's there so Kelsey can write his 50-line demos is good.
So what I was envisioning, and maybe I didn't correctly outline, is imagine a world where when Kubernetes schedule a pod, it reaches to an identity provider, let's say Active Directory, or let's say Google Authentication, and it gets an OAuth token or a Kerberos key. That gets then handed to the pod as part of the pod creation and says, here's your identity, and that gets presented to a secret provider, let's say Vault or KMS, what have you, and say, please unlock my secrets. And all the long-lived secrets come from that. They're exposed to the application in a common manner that the application developer really doesn't need to understand, like we can do a pseudo file system or whatever you. But I'm not suggesting that the application credential actually get rotated. I'm suggesting that the bootstrap identity that is used to unlock the secrets will be ephemeral and disappears when the pods go away.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it does, and we've talked a lot recently about, in a sense, Kubernetes has an abstraction for hiding how information is injected into naive pods. So an application that's not cloud aware or not environment aware, and that's usually the volume plugin. Flex volumes were intended to make it easy to inject new volume types. I think there's this is somewhat of a fairly new concept for many people, but it's been something that's been discussed for a while internally or in various SIG groups and other forums. Was the volume interface in Kubernetes offers an abstraction point to decouple applications from how they get access to things like secrets. And so in theory, it should be easy to add new volume plugins that completely abstract the details of how secrets are unlocked and delivered by things like Vault or external secret source or KMS providers. And it should be possible to install those on a kube cluster and get access to that without the application really having to be aware of it. So I think yes, and there may be multiple mechanisms. We can put that in the goals section as I think it's close. It's described in a few places, but make it easy to get access to the application secrets in a way that's fairly agnostic of the mechanism whereby those secrets are delivered to prevent accidental or poorly designed applications from unintentionally opening themselves to compromise by using secrets inappropriately.
This is Dimitri. I have another question, and looking a little bit at the document down there, I was wondering if we can spend a little bit of time or to discuss what is an identity in the first place. So is an identity something that says this is XYZ, or is it claims-based identity? Because some authorization systems, because we say that we want to make the authorization system simpler, some authorization systems can become simpler with a claims-based identity. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts there?
I don't think we want to over-specify it. I mean, some systems deal in signed assertions, some deal in TLS client certificates, some deal in ticket granting tickets with expiration. I think there's a lot of different solutions we need to enable.
Yeah, that's why I'm bringing it up, because down there is maybe I'm jumping the gun over here, right? There is a discussion whether the identity has to be a JWT, whether the identity has to be a certificate or whatever. But if we don't define what the identity needs to be, so if, for example, it's a certificate, we pretty much make it very hard for any claim-based systems or tickets or anything like that to come on top. So that's why I'm wondering, how can we define that in a way that makes it as generic as possible?
So I personally think that the identity provider should be pluggable, meaning, we should allow for a Kerberos one and maybe an LDAP one and a OAuth one and a claim-based one. But the point that I think, but maybe I'm kind of just jumping the gun here, is that other than identity and secret provider, I think there's another thing that we might want to consider, which is asserting claims. An example for that for Google might be is that there is a hardware chip on the machine that can assert to the authenticity of the machine requesting access to unlock the secrets.
So this was discussed later in the doc, but it seemed like, and please someone correct me if I'm wrong, that the idea was that we would build sort of exchanges. So you write something that speaks your specific, that hooks up to your identity provider like Azure or Active Directory or Kerberos. And then when a pod comes online, it exchanges its sort of opaque Kubernetes identity for the identity of your target system. So that's the pluggability point, rather than making the credentials that your pod gets, or maybe it doesn't even see, pluggable from the get-go.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to just echo Eric there. So the kind of ideas I presented here were that one, that the JOT has a lot of kind of downsides, and the implementation of kind of how we're delivering it through secrets has a bunch of downsides for just what backs the service account. And so I basically did pros and cons for like making that an X509 just for the Kubernetes service account. And then the second idea, was this idea of exchanges, that you could take that base identity and exchange it for something else. That I think there is definitely a discussion to be had about. We'll essentially have to, say we did that, we essentially have made service accounts pluggable, but we've only got two options at the moment. I think there's a discussion to be had to, should the pluggability be at that layer, and we open up service account to be backed by all sorts of different things, as Mark kind of just listed off? Or is it kind of how I presented in this doc, where there's really only two kind of core ways to, and then one we're trying to deprecate and one we're trying to move to, for the core identity for service accounts, and that we exchange for everything else. So we would develop like this exchange API where you would have some way to take that JOT or that X509 that core Kubernetes gives you and turn it into whatever identity you wanted.
Right. And the additional problem with this exchange accounts is that it leads to all kinds of convergence issues that you have to deal with, because the pod creation and the exchange account creation need to be coordinated. Essentially, the pod identity creation and the exchange account ACLs or translation rules need to be coordinated. And this leads to a whole bunch of, I think, unnecessary convergence problems that can potentially be avoided by coming up with a definition of identity that is more flexible.
Yeah, I think this is a topic that will probably consume an entire working group meeting. It's one of the early discussions. I think, from my perspective, like, there's two things that we cannot do. We will not break existing applications on Kubernetes. That's unacceptable / not allowed. And we need to define a gradual path for these new things to extend and to fit without blocking on changes going into core Kubernetes. And so I think the good thing is that a focus on the mechanisms whereby complete orthogonality to Kubernetes identity can be explored are going to overlap a lot with the patterns that we have talked about for extending Kube. This is a really concrete example. The only way that a pod gets access to a service account token today is via an emission controller that injects it. That's not an automatic part of Kubernetes. It's not easy to turn off or customize today. But if we do our jobs correctly in the SIG, I would hope that the outcome is it's very easy for someone to inject an identity that the application is completely unaware of, and Kube is also unaware of. And I think there's two parts of this, which is the mechanism that we use to deliver and to make this integration. If it depends on core Kube changes and takes 3 releases, it's not going to be very successful anyway. And so to hammer on that point, like, we have to build this in a way that can be layered on top of Kube. And I think that opens the door to, we'll try to do our best to have a good technical solution out of the box, but we will at the same time have to prove that this can be done by anyone and completely ignores the existence of prior art or existing art in Kubernetes, and people are still successful doing that.
So just going back for a second to my question. So in the outlines that I think was covered, there's the bootstrap identity and then there's the secret store. In my mind, there's a third component, which is some kind of an external assertion mechanism that can assert additional claims on top of the identity in order to gain access to the secret provider. Would you agree with that?
So I think, like Clayton talked about, we don't want to get into authentication mechanism exactly, but I think you can't help but overlap a little bit when you're talking about identity. We're talking about the mechanism of the identity, and for example, talking about the JOT versus X509 case, I would say that a JOT-based identity. So we need to talk about the mechanism so that we understand what kinds of authentication systems you can build.
I think we know what our second working group meeting is going to be about, and it's going to be trying to scope out where we all stand on this and what are the downsides and advantages. So maybe, like, do we want to explicitly go ahead and say that maybe the second working group meeting will be diving into the details of, are there obvious wins, obvious faults to some of the approaches, either search, JWTs, or the exchange mechanism that we want to explore enough to have a framework to start making some value judgments on these?
Yeah, this is a question we've debated a lot internally. I think we could easily spend a whole meeting talking about it.
Great.
Yeah, it works for me.
I'll take some notes here. A
random question. I think it would be good if we could think more scenarios from the federation perspective as well. I think, as far as I know, the federation at the authentication or identity management at the federation level is behavior is slightly kind of a pass-through mechanism. when it comes to the cluster. So have we thought about any use cases in that perspective as well?
So I would like to sort of address that, because I think that when people talk about federation, they're talking about two sort of things. One is I want to run lots of workloads across multiple clusters, have a single pane of glass, that kind of thing. But I think that, that's exactly. But there's the other aspect of it that I think we've been feeling a lot of pain, which is this concept of like multi-cluster registration, that when that most of our customers are running 10 or so clusters, need to have some, registration mechanism or something like that. So we can do login across multiple clusters. So if you're staring at one of your clusters or staring at the registry, that you can know where all the others clusters operate. I think that this sort of plays into more that whatever we do with this effort, there needs to be some mechanism for a different cluster to start trusting the identities minted by your own cluster, possibly, or a different one.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good point. Like it kind of like varies based on what realm you're in, right? Like in the enterprise, if you're talking within a single company, everybody already has federated identity. It's called LDAP, and then everybody who really cares about processes has federated identity for processes, which is Kerberos. And so there's the bridge step is that's easier actually in the enterprise environment because they have that bedrock assumption. And in the cloud environment, you also start to talk about things like the failure domain of a particular identity provider, where those kinds of multi-cluster use cases come up. So I think we should definitely queue up that topic. I kind of agree that both sides of it could actually be, if we look at use cases, I think surviving the failure of another cluster is one of the reasons people have multi-cluster. And so, identity failing is something people worry about. The other alternative is I want to be resilient to other failures, such as across cloud providers. And in those scenarios, there may actually not be a global identity. And both of those are definitely relevant to the long-term discussion.
But I do think we need to take the working assumptions that that non-cluster based identity would probably be the norm. Like, while we can have self-issuing identities for Kubernetes, that's probably not a common enterprise use case or cloud use case.
Well, it's actually interesting, which is I think that most people who have identities today have human identities and don't have process identity. So that is maybe the example of we need to have a good model that lets someone grow up into the right outcome, which is non-cluster based identity. And so that gets to the point about service accounts earlier, which is service accounts do complicate that, but they're very useful for people who have no concept of process identity today as a bridge step. So another follow-on topic we can talk about. So I'll record this in the notes.
I do think that process identity is actually very common. Like if you look at AWS or Google, both of us have service account concept. I believe Azure has as well with Azure ID, and it also exists in OpenStack.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's uncommon.
OpenStack was actually an interesting one because OpenStack had an additional requirement that very few other people have, which is federating identity across many different corporate LDAPs, which, to be honest, is something that I prefer not to have to deal with because it also causes, there's a lot of challenges in that. I think maybe we could say that in the near-term goal, allowing you to integrate to an identity source of truth is important. Allowing you to ourselves supporting federated identity ourselves is not desirable, but allowing you to have mechanisms whereby you can go solve that is important. So it might be like, do we solve it? No. Should we make it possible to be solved? Yes.
I agree.
There is one more potential use case that I don't know if you guys have thought about, and this is a loose form of multi-tenancy. Let me explain what I mean here is that the identity for some pods can be routed to a different root of trust rather than the identity of the other pods. An example is I have production workloads and dev workloads running on the same cluster, and I just want to root the identity of the two types of workloads completely different so they can never do anything among each other.
So I think that use case requires some discussion. From a security standpoint, I would say that identities are only as good as whoever has set for them, and if the cluster can accept for both production and dev identities, that you really have a point of compromise that is significant.
But you might have different external routes, right?
But in
Definitely.
In that case, can you just create two separate clusters to run production and dev?
I think, and maybe this gets to like something that we hammer on a lot in Kubernetes is, in an ideal world, there are different tenant workloads on a cluster. We're not as there from a strong perspective as we'd like in Kubernetes, but we want it to be possible to do that. So we should definitely take it as a consideration, even if it's not a, I think Kubernetes works best when it's fairly composable, and the kind of the best practice or the things that work well at scale is the maybe default or suggested mechanism with the break glass solution in So like as an example would be service account tokens are what carry the CA into a pod. Many people rely on that. There's absolutely nothing that would prevent us from saying, letting someone drop in another CA for a different set of workloads and letting that be possible to build via extensions and documenting or explaining how that, that's a very concrete way to achieve some of those goals without us necessarily saying that that's our primary path. To completely opt out. The right to opt out of what Kubernetes thinks makes sense, I think, is one of the rights that we enshrine very deeply in the Kubernetes constitution. Other topics, we're getting close. So, I mean, we're getting close to the next hour, to the end of the hour. I was going to suggest we probably need to settle on a recurring time. I know this is a little early and overlaps with SIG PM. We are trying to catch people in European time as well as in PDT, Pacific time. So the 11 to 2 p.m. EDT slot, which is the slot that every other Kubernetes SIG also schedules into, is one of the more workable ranges. I will set up another doodle and try to find a recurring time, give people a chance to vote again for everybody who attended today, and make a note of that. So Clayton will be cool. I would recommend that if there's any other discussion that we didn't cover here, that we get comfortable discussing this on the working group container identity mailing list as we prep for our next meeting. And then is it enough to assume that the topic for the next meeting is going to be diving into the details of what might happen on a node? Do we feel that, I guess we can use the time between now and the next meeting to make sure that there's any other use cases or goals or non-goals that we bring those up in the Google group?
I think it really makes sense to talk a little bit more about the non-goals before we dig into the details of the implementation.
Sure. Do we? So how about this? We'll post the non-goals as we have them in this doc to the working group email list, and folks should really focus on identifying other non-goals that they would like to see show up there.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay. Other topics folks want to bring up about either the next meeting or unclosed areas that are important to talk about? Take that as a no. All right. Any parting thoughts before we end the call?
Thanks a lot for doing this. This is really exciting.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for showing up. I know that sometimes the coordination for pulling these together gets a little chaotic, but hopefully we can have some discussions. I don't know that we have any concrete goals for 1.8 to deliver, but I certainly would like to, identify early things that might overlap to other SIGs, like features that we might want that are prereqs or gate us. And so that is something as well to maybe think about before the next meeting is capabilities in Cube that might be lacking for some of the things that we know we need.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.